Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to assess how Borussia Dortmund were able to keep pace with Bayern Munich at the top of the Bundesliga by sneaking past Hertha Berlin. When we break it all down and we do look at the board, we have Borussia Dortmund in more of a 3-4-1-2 with Julian Brandt floating between the lines just in behind Thorgan Hazard and Jadon Sancho. And then you have Hertha Berlin in a 4-2-3-1. Dortmund did dominate possession for large spells of this game, but they did do a very good job defensively out of possession. They did drop off into a 5-4-1. They had Sancho and Hazard looking to step out into the path of Piszczek and Mittelstadt. And even if Sancho and Hazard weren't able to shift out into those wider zones, what would happen is that they would have Hakimi step out into the path of Mittelstadt and then have the center back in Piszczek come across to deal with Lucien. When you look at that 5-4-1, they were very compact and narrow. So you would have Delaney and Witsel stepping into the path of Grujic and Skelbred. And what ended up happening here was that the Hertha Berlin midfield eventually had to drop off deeper into the space around Julian Brandt to receive the ball. And the problem that they had here was that there was no link for Ibisevic. So when Guerreiro tried to receive the ball in behind Witsel and Delaney, all Dortmund had to do was have the closest center back step into his path, and then it would still be 2v1 with the spare center backs against Ibisevic. So what ended up happening was that the only real threat that Hertha Berlin could possibly pose was in transition, but even then Delaney and Witsel did a very good job of breaking up play. This game was about Dortmund trying to break down Hertha Berlin, who ended up dropping off into two banks of four, and what they ended up doing was that they had Guerreiro looking to try and close down Witsel when he dropped off deeper to try and get on the ball, and that left Delaney against Skelbred and Grujic. Hertha Berlin often allowed Delaney to get on the ball unless he pushed into that final third, and that was because Skelbred and Grujic were wary of Julian Brandt dropping off deeper into those zones. What we ended up seeing from Dortmund was that Brandt was floating between the lines as expected, looking to drop into those pockets of space to receive the ball. At times he was dropping off ahead of the midfield bank if he was starved for service, and there were times where we ended up seeing the ball shifted out to Raphael, Guerreiro, and Hakimi, and Brandt would look to drop in behind the wide player, closing down those wingbacks to try and receive the ball. So that was Brandt's role in that system. And what we ended up seeing from Hazard and Sancho was that they often reverted from looking to run in behind. We have seen that from Hazard over the past few weeks, but they were often shifting into space between the center back and the fullback and looking to check in when the wingbacks did get on the ball. Sancho in particular was doing that, dropping off into space behind the fullback, looking to peel off the center back and shift laterally across the fullback on that same side. Or there were times where he was shifting from the right to the left to try and create overloads. The biggest threat that Dortmund posed in that opening half was based off the fact that Luke Bacchio and Lucien weren't doing a good job of tracking the movement of Raphael, Guerreiro, and Hakimi. So there was always an outlet pass into the wingbacks because of Hertha Berlin's shape. They were very narrow, and all you had to really do was shift the ball out into Raphael, Guerreiro, and Hakimi. That would eventually pull out Piszczek, or it would pull out Mittelstadt, and that's where you can have Sancho and Hazard dropping off deeper to combine with the wingbacks. While Julian Brandt did play a key role once again in Dortmund's midfield, it was Jadon Sancho who was the key player and involved in some of Dortmund's best moves on both flanks combining with the wingbacks. When we look to one example, what we end up seeing is Piszczek sliding the ball out to Hakimi ahead of Mittelstadt, and when Hakimi receives that ball, what should be identified here was that Sancho initially started his positioning to the right of Torunariga. What we end up seeing is that once Hakimi receives that ball, he instantly plays it to Sancho, dropping off to Torunariga to receive the ball. When Sancho receives that ball, he ends up playing it beyond the Hertha Berlin center back, and he plays it into the path of the right half space for Hakimi running off Mittelstadt to break into the box. What ends up happening here, though, is that Skelbred does read that play well, and he shifts across the pitch to apply some pressure to Hakimi breaking into the box, and Hakimi fires a shot into side netting. Shortly after that, we focus on Delaney receiving the ball ahead of Derrida and Grujic. And what we end up seeing from Delaney is that there's no pressure on him, and he ends up clipping a ball over Luke Bacchio into the path of Raphael Guerreiro. That pulls out Piszczek, and what should be identified here is that it's Sancho again shifting into that space laterally in between Boyata and Piszczek. That's where we see Raphael Guerreiro and Sancho combine, and Raphael Guerreiro is able to break in beyond Piszczek into that left half space, and Boyata does a very good job of reading that play and holding off Raphael Guerreiro. And when Guerreiro tries to get out of danger, he backheels the ball into the path of Sancho breaking into the box, but his pass is slightly behind him. When we look to one final example, what we end up seeing is Akanji pushing forward from left center back, and he wraps the ball around Ibisevic into the path of Brandt, dropping off ahead of Skelbred to receive the ball. Brandt ends up dropping off into his own half, and he ends up locating Hakimi running off Dilrosun, and he clips a diagonal ball out to Hakimi. When Hakimi receives the ball in that right channel, what we should stop and locate is the fact that you have Hazard in between Piszczek and Boyata, and you have Sancho dropping off into that space ahead of Middlestad and Torunariga. When Hakimi plays that ball into Sancho, before Torunariga can step into his path, Sancho ends up playing it across Middlestad into the path of Hakimi, breaking into that right half space. And when he delivers across into Hazard looking to run across Boyata, Boyata does a very good job of reading it last ditch, and he ends up clearing those lines. The other threat that Dortmund posed through open play was Akanji's ability to move forward and play positive passes. So as you can see in that opening half, Dortmund were able to exploit holes in Hertha Berlin's system. So it was always going to be interesting to see how they would adjust in the second half. Esswein did replace Dilrosun due to injury in that first half. And at the start of the second half, we ended up seeing Emre Can replace Luke Bacchio. So now you have two new wide players in those roles looking to close down Raphael Guerreiro and Hakimi. And that did present optimism for Hertha Berlin fans. But initially, what we ended up seeing was that they did a good job of stopping Brandt from getting the ball between the lines. We had two examples in those opening 5 minutes where we had Akanji stepping forward, and in the initial move, you have Derrida stepping to Witsel and Grujic stepping into the path of Delaney. Akanji ends up splitting Skelbred and Grujic to find Brandt, but that's when you see Torunariga step forward into the path of Brandt, and he ends up winning the ball. And minutes later, this time it's Akanji sliding the ball out to Raphael Guerreiro in his own half. And when Raphael Guerreiro pushes forward and is closed down by Can, that's when you see Brandt dropping off ahead of Boyata and Piszczek. And when Raphael Guerreiro plays that pass into Brandt, Boyata's tight on Brandt, and he ends up winning the ball, but he instantly gives it away. Nevertheless, Dortmund were persistent with finding Brandt in that space, and seconds later they created their best chance of the game. It's Witsel on the ball, and he looks to split Grujic and Skelbred to find Brandt dropping off deeper ahead of Boyata, but when he plays that initial pass, it is blocked by Grujic, but he ends up winning that ball, and then he's closed down by Can and Skelbred. Witsel is able to hold off Can, and he ends up playing the ball into the path of Witsel and combining with him to bypass that midfield. And then you end up seeing Witsel slide the ball across Torunariga for Hakimi pushing forward in that right half space. Hakimi does a very good job of playing a low cross through that 6-yard box, and with Hazard peeling off at that back post, he's able to get on the ball and pull it back into the path of Sancho, with Boyata looking to recover his positioning. Sancho instantly slides that ball ahead of that 6-yard box, inches wide of the net, and that's where Dortmund should take the lead. On the opposite flank, Can did a better job in limiting Raphael Guerreiro, and that discipline did lead to their best opportunity of the game, because when Raphael Guerreiro pushed forward, he was dispossessed by Can, and he ended up squaring the ball into the path of Skelbred, who slid it across that Dortmund midfield to Derrida. Now you have Derrida able to run at that Dortmund back three because the wingbacks are caught higher up the pitch. And what you end up seeing is Esswein running across Piszczek, and then you have the movement of Ibisevic across Akanji. What Derrida does well here is that he wraps the ball across Can and Akanji, who is moving towards Ibisevic, and that allows Esswein to run across Piszczek to receive that ball in right half space. But he ends up rushing his shot with Witsel recovering his positioning, positioning, and he fires his effort inches wide of the far post. The significance behind that chance from Hertha Berlin was based off the fact that Emre Can was brought on to do that job. And if you're able to track the movement of the Dortmund wingbacks and win possession, then you're basically attacking space in those wider areas because of their high positioning. So that was how they were able to get into that zone, and that was crucial. Unfortunately for Hertha Berlin, Dortmund were able to take the lead shortly after that based off their inability to clear their lines from a set piece. And it does involve Sancho and Brandt. Hertha Berlin's attempt to chase the game ended up seeing them bring on Piszczek for Skelbred, and they end up moving to more of a 4-4-2. Following those moves, there was no real progression into that game. We ended up seeing Dortmund's wingbacks have more space to push forward and beyond the wider players because they were forced to tuck in narrow. And we also ended up seeing Dortmund be able to bypass that press because they ended up having their front three dropping off deeper to overload that center of the pitch. When you break down that game as a whole, it was very simple. Dortmund were able to exploit space in wider areas beyond Hertha Berlin's narrow shape. The wingbacks were able to get in beyond on a consistent basis. Sancho and Brandt had time and space to drift laterally to combine with those players. And then you had Delaney and Akanji also having time on the ball to help Dortmund continue their dominance. The only issue that you can have with Dortmund in this performance was that it was a bit lackadaisical, and they were wasteful when they got into good positions. But when you look at their best chances, it was the combination of the wing backs and the combination of Brandt and Sancho that made the difference here. And that's the reason why Dortmund remains 7 points behind Bayern Munich and keeping that Bundesliga title hope alive. Hi everybody, thanks for watching, and subscribe here for your latest tactical analysis and daily commentary on the InnerViews show. And if that wasn't enough, don't forget you could find more organic, unfiltered soccer/football analysis on the InnerViews podcast, the best soccer/football podcast in the world, available on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and any Android apps on your Android devices.